Hi, everybody. Just going to give it a couple seconds, let everyone sort of filter in here, and then we'll get started with the webinar for today. Alrighty, I see that number sort of starting to tick up there. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Employment Law, Remote Work. I'm Alex Shuretsky with Talent Canada and Annex Business Media. Before I pass it over to our moderator and speakers this afternoon, I'd like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded, so for any reason you have to leave early or you miss part of the presentation, a link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants in 24 hours. Secondly, questions can and should be submitted to the Q&A folder at the bottom right of your screen, and all questions will be saved for the end of today's presentation. Now I'd like to pass it over to Allison Darling, our moderator for this webinar. Over to you, Allison. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thanks so much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be able to collaborate with Talent Canada on the webinar today about the rights, needs, and factors surrounding remote work. I'm absolutely thrilled to be moderating today's session. So as Alex said, I'm Alison Darling. I'm the Director of Professional Programs here at Queen's University IRC, located in Kingston, Ontario. For over 85 years, the IRC has been delivering professional development programs in the areas of labor relations, human resources, and organizational development. Our award-winning programs are offered coast to coast across Canada, in addition to our virtual classroom. In 2024, we will be coming to Victoria, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, here in Kingston, and Halifax. So if you do get the chance, we would love to see you in some of our programs. Our programs are designed for busy professionals such as yourselves and are facilitated by industry experts and thought leaders to ensure that participants leave with the skills needed to make a difference in their organization. So today I am delighted to be joined by two of these experts, Linda Allen Hardesty and Deborah Hudson. So a little bit about our facilitators before we get into the webinar today. So Linda Allen Hardesty is an organizational development professional, and she holds her Queen's IRC OD certificate. She's an executive coach, a team coach, and a Forbes Coach Council contributing member. She's built a reputation as a vibrant contemporary voice in the business world by blending her grounding in OD with a practical approach to addressing organizational challenges and opportunities. She facilitates our coaching skills, performance management, and building trust using emotional intelligence programs here at the IRC. Deborah Hudson is one of the founding partners of Hudson Sinclair LLP. Deborah represents both employers and employees in all aspects of labor and employment law. She was called to the Ontario Bar in 2008, and she's practiced exclusively in the areas of labor and employment law for her entire career. Deborah regularly advises both employers and employees in relation to matters occurring at all stages of the employment relationship, including areas such as contracts, accommodations, human rights matters, and terminations. Deborah speaks in our Mastering Fact-Finding and Investigations program. So it's great to see so many of you on the call today. We understand that this is a very timely and important topic for many, many people. So let's jump right into the topic. As Alex has said, we will spend about 30 to 40 minutes in our kind of formal session here, and then we will open it up to Q&A at the end. So if you're thinking of questions, please do feel free to submit them throughout the presentation, and we will certainly address them at the end. Okay, so Deborah, I'm going to come to you first of all. Let's focus first of all on the legal aspects. What does the law say about the rights to remote work?
So I would say the law is actually quite simple on the topic, whereas the employee relations and other topics that we'll discuss is a little bit more complicated. But in general, employers have a right to direct where a worker is located. So if they want their team to work at an office, they can direct them to do so. There are a few exceptions. The first one would be if the employee's contract or the applicable collective agreement has provisions that say that the position's remote or the position's hybrid. In those cases, an employer has to honor those agreements. And the second exception would be, just based on general practice, if an employee's been working from home their entire tenure or for the last 3 or 4 years, they might be able to make a constructive dismissal argument if they're required to go back to the office. But employers can mitigate a lot of those types of arguments by just providing sufficient notice. So, they say, hey, team, we're going back to the office in 6 months or 4 months. It's going to, the amount of notice will depend on how long the particular circumstance of how long the person has worked remotely. But in general, I would say it's actually quite simple. Generally, employers can require employees to work from the office. And the employee relations part of it, that Linda will get into more, that's more complicated, considering, attraction, retention, productivity, and all those other things that we'll be talking about.
Deborah, I'm going to pick up on something that I heard you say, that this is the relationship side of it is the more complicated, is definitely the more complex, and probably the greatest space with the greatest opportunity to figure out what is most needed to deliver on that organization's strategy and purpose and mandate, while attracting, retaining, and developing people to be as engaged as they can in the workplace. And so I think that was a great way to describe it. And that's this one great way to really look at how that might function in there, for sure, on the relationship side of that. And are you seeing that a little bit as well in the conversations you're having with your clients?
I would say, so I act for both employers and employees, so I see it from
Yes.
both ends. But we are contacted by a lot of employees over the last year or two when they were called back to the office with concerns, not wanting to go back, and employers, are worried about things like productivity, and so it's definitely more about the relationship piece and trust. And I can speak for myself. Our office is fully remote, and we have great team all over Ontario, and some of our team members who are fantastic just don't want to come into the city. So we've been able to, hire some great people who we wouldn't otherwise, be in our talent pool. So I definitely think that the law part is more easy, and the employee relations part is definitely more complicated. And it was an employee side market, coming out of the pandemic, where employees really got to dictate terms. I'm starting to see a bit of a shift in that. I'm seeing a lot of terminations coming up this fall. But I think that it's a complicated topic, and it's really the employee relations piece that we want to dig into today versus the, where can an employer require that I work?
And I'm noticing things are starting to shift a little bit as well. Now that we've experienced what it's like to be remote, the conversation is still ongoing, and leaders are really trying to figure out too the best way. And what we did really, what I observed a lot happening during the pandemic was, anyone who particularly was a desk worker in particular, but other types that lend itself well to working remotely, everyone got a taste of autonomy, and people either liked it or they didn't. But that for a while there, we all got to experience what it was like to be autonomous, to be in our home, to really figure out our time management a little bit. And not everybody had the same experience with that. And now what we're really keeping our eye on, and I think this is where some of the complexity happens. We learned about the autonomy, but now we need to keep talking about the relationship side of work and what that is like. And research is still ongoing to really help us better understand what is more required, what does work best. And it isn't always one size that fits all. So we also, I think, have seen a lot of people, whether you're a leader or a individual contributor in an organization, what it's like to now realize maybe I do need to see some people in person. And that connection there is really also on top of a leader's mind too, to really connect with their team, to really express a lot of empathy with them, to understand where they're coming from and what they need and what works best. And I'm definitely seeing a lot of organizations go the hybrid model, especially if it's a desk job or a type of job that requires that. But we have an awful lot of employees and leaders who are in roles that are actually out in the field in some sense, where there isn't a real like one position, a desk job to be at. But the aspect of relationship is really top of mind. How do we build team? being able to make decisions with each other, problem solve. And what I'm now really starting to see is now that people are coming back in person, if not all the time, part of the time, that they're really starting to have more conflict resolution type conversations more now. That would be the part of the remote work that was probably one of the most challenging, is how to resolve conflict with each other remotely. And now that people are back in person, I'm almost starting to observe people wanting to or needing to dig into some of that disconnection that happened differently. One leader said to me, Linda, I think people are still learning how to people again now that we get back in person. So those are definitely some of the things that I'm starting to observe in hybrid remote work, in person, and how leaders and organizations are really trying to figure this out and connect with their employees.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's not a one size fits all approach. Everybody's needs are different. Every team is different. Every person is different. But something I can speak to in my practice, I conduct a lot of workplace investigations. And so, I'm reviewing complaints, and it sort of, goes into some of the stuff you were saying, Linda. I've seen miscommunications happen in fully remote teams or mainly remote teams where complainants are coming to me and they feel harassed. And it's a lot of it, I think, a lot of communications by emails or Slack or whatever channels that particular organization's using, things are getting lost and there's miscommunications and people are interpreting that as harassment, or they're not able, perhaps the respondent's unable to see an individual's facial response or body language that might have otherwise made them back off or apologize or communicate differently. So definitely in my workplace investigation, workplace harassment practice, I think that the fully remote model or mainly remote model, I'm seeing those miscommunications pieces because people have forgot how to people, as Linda said. But that's something that's coming up a lot with the remote work piece, and even, I do a lot of my investigations remotely, but I do offer in person when people feel more comfortable. I actually think some people do feel more comfortable remote to be at home in the comfort of their own home doing the interview rather than in person. But for other people, they want in person, we do it that way. Again, not a one size fits all approach.
So there is an upside to those remote options, especially if it's a preference of someone else as well. One of the other things that was starting to notice when everyone was remote, and if you'll notice all of us right now on the screen, there's no hierarchy to where our photos sit, like where our screens are. And so some people noticed there was more opportunity for inclusive conversation because there was no hierarchy on the screen. So some groups felt more comfortable speaking up. Different people felt that they could speak up and say more things remotely than they ever could when they were in person, if they were sitting in a boardroom with someone at the head of the table and all those physical positions that people sometimes take. So that kind of opened our eyes too, to realize, there is another way to get at diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. What did we learn about remote as another option to have conversation and to create team that doesn't always have to be in person? So back to your original comment, there's a lot of complexities here, but there's a lot of options and opportunity for people, and not unlike what we just experienced here. We're just rolling with it. And Allison, I know that you're back online, but we did not plan this, but this is typically sometimes what can happen when you're having a remote presentation or conversation. The internet and connection also is invited to the party.
It's very true. I do apologize about that. Of course, you have no internet issues all day, and the moment you get on a live presentation, the system takes on a mind of itself. So I do apologize about that. Yes, very timely on a on a topic on remote work and some of the issues and complexities that can arise. Of course, the moderator goes and is now frantically trying to work out where we are going with the conversation and what we've done. But it sounds like obviously we've touched on the legal aspect, touching on some of those other people pieces as well. Are there, and forgive me if this has been covered, what were some of the issues that we saw coming out, maybe back with regards to the legal aspects? Did that result in things like more complaints that you saw, Deborah? What were some of the pieces potentially there?
Absolutely. So we definitely saw more like a certain type of workplace harassment complaint coming out that seemed to be miscommunications. I also had a lot of employers raise issues about like productivity, like is this person actually working? And sort of what some people have sort of shared with me is the really good employees are even better at home, and some of the employees that might need more feedback, support, and all that kind of stuff struggled a bit more. Sometimes, the worst case scenario, people didn't know if their employees were actually online or not. Like, are they doing something else? So, all sorts of these issues. And, legally, employers are entitled to do certain things, like they can monitor your work-related email, they can put tracking type of measures on computers. Different provinces might have some legislations around providing notice on that stuff, but generally a lot of those types of practices are legal. But, as an employment lawyer, I don't like those types of measures because I don't think it's good for the employee relations piece. I think that, a great employment relationship is based on trust and providing some autonomy. And, I have concerns if, those types of measures are in place, if that, impacts that relational piece. And, ultimately, again, it goes back to not the law, but the employee relations piece that Linda can speak to. Yeah, so that's something that, I've seen a lot of questions around productivity, tracking, and that sort of thing as well.
Great, thank you. So then, Linda, yeah, from a people perspective, maybe what would your guidance advice be there? What have you noticed with the clients that you're working with?
Yes, thanks, Allison. That's a great next kind of segue to this whole thing. And that's one of the things I've really noticed is that anyone in a leadership role, the role has evolved, and we've learned a lot over the last 4 years. And using and leveraging empathy as a way to really be curious and gain an understanding and create that relationship with an employee has been elevated more than ever. And I also think that's why there's an increase uptake and interest in understanding emotional intelligence and how to develop it. I was just talking to a leader for an early morning coffee today, and the conversation was, can we learn how to be more emotionally effective? Is that just our personality, or how do we learn these skills to really do an even better job at that? And even more, we're also now recently starting to see some research indicate that before the pandemic, we did have pretty high loneliness levels, and there's been a 30% increase in what people are saying they're feeling lonely now than before. And so I think that's a whole area as well for employers and people in leadership roles to be really curious about, is that aspect of loneliness. And an awful lot is really put on the plate of a leader, but yet they are also in the greatest role and opportunity to really explore and figure that out for sure. So there's a lot of things that, and I still think the research of what remote and hybrid and in person, the whole blend, what that looks like, we're still gaining an understanding of what that might mean, but it does grab my attention when I see things like we've got increased complaints, and we've got higher levels of loneliness. And the question around performance management, one of the things I always start with a leader is, so before the pandemic, before so much remote work, how were you monitoring performance before? How were you coaching for performance before? What were those outcomes and those metrics? And what has changed since then? And I have noticed a little bit too that the lack of good performance metrics and feedback before really was even made it worse once we were. So I think people in leadership roles are also still learning how to write those performance objectives, develop that, coach for performance, being able to check on and see the outcomes and the outputs of what their teams are actually delivering it. That has also, I think, really increased the need for performance, but also coaching for performance is that's a greater call for that as well.
And different employers have different objectives. Like some employers don't require an employee to be online from 9 to 5, but the performance measure is we want these these key things done. And they don't care if the parent goes to pick up their child from school or someone takes an appointment, as long as they're available for the scheduled meetings and they're getting their work done. So depending on the role, it's different for every type of workplace. And, you know, I think that that's great. It's a sort of case by case situation, and you go from there.
Yeah, definitely. People are figuring out how to fit their work around life instead of the other way around. And in examples that you just shared, there are a lot of people who one of the reasons they're performing better is that everything is just all clicking better for them. It's really fitting really well into that. So it's not only what we do, but it's how we do it that I think is getting a lot of attention. Yeah.
Yeah, and Linda, you touched on an interesting point, I think, about loneliness, and a 30% increase in loneliness. That's a staggering statistic. So then, Deborah, I'm wondering, even from a legal perspective, we've kind of talked a bit about the rights of employers and employees with regards to working from home, but does the employer have any kind of, I suppose, legal legalities that they have to stand by with regards to ensuring that their staff members are, feeling part of a team? What is there anything that law says with regards to that, to try and create that sense of community?
I mean, I would say I don't know that there's any sort of legal obligations, but what I can say, and especially coming out of the pandemic, there was an uptick of employees on short-term and long-term disability. That affects an employer's, workplace and financials and stuff like that, because people were, facing loneliness, anxiety, depression, and that is an impact rather than a law, but that is an impact. And again, I think it goes more to productivity, because if they have to engage in a workplace investigator, like say an external source, that's very expensive. And it's time consuming. There's a lot of opportunity losses on the team if someone's placed on a paid leave or into a different department, and it can really impact the team. Usually investigations can take, a month, 2 months, 3 months. And so there's an impact. Again, legally, they're going to have to investigate workplace harassment complaints. The obligations are different in every province, but generally they have to investigate. And then there's an impact on the team. So again, not actually legal requirement on the connection piece and the isolation piece, but definitely impacts that I'm seeing in my practice from employees and employers alike. So.
Excellent points. So I think that kind of leads me to my next question then. Maybe what would be the benefits to an employer of allowing people to work remotely, to allowing some of their team members? What would be some of the benefits then? I think we've touched on some of those, but kind of looking at that, as an overall topic, Linda and Deborah, I'd love to hear from both of you regarding that. Oh, Linda, I think your microphone.
Yes, the benefits of remote work is your question, right, Allison? Yeah. I think that really goes back to, like I'll emphasize what Deborah said, that one size does not fit all. But what I've really noticed is the conversation about where there is option and choice. A very common model I've seen with a lot of office or desk type environments are 2 days in the office, 2 days at home, and then 1 day floater, kind of to be determined. And a lot of people like that option. In fact, I know I did speak with one who didn't choose any of them remote. They wanted to be there full time. But when there's that element of choice, that does say that I trust you and I'm really curious what's going to work best for you. Is that a Monday, Friday? Is it a Wednesday? So where there can be choice, and that conversation needs to happen. And it's conversation and choice within a structure. Like there are some structure and parameters and guidelines for which that works. And I also think people like the structure. There is some expectation that we are in the office together for certain reasons. And, you know, so it's a blend of autonomy and structure. And I think we all want to know where the boundaries are. What are the expectations? People appreciate that too, as well as how can we make this work best for you? Yeah, and your example about being able to do something over a noon hour or during the afternoon and then get back. And as long as you, for some places, yeah, the time and the clock is relevant, and for others it's not. But I think that it's the structure and then that conversation with people that is the leader showing empathy. It's building that relationship. We now know so much about remote. It's a legitimate tool. It's not the answer for everything, but now we've got some skills around how to do that. I think you really build that relationship. You understand the trust within that culture and that environment and how things are going to operate. People of all levels want to know where they stand. We all want to know how we're doing. And so I think that approach really enables the right conversation. And it really does say where the manager or someone in a leadership position is really critical and key for that. And I'm seeing a lot of organizations invest in developing and training their managers even more and more and more and more, because they need those learning and skills and confidence to do and have these complex conversations with their staff. So those organizations who are investing in manager skills and ability are also seeing a direct, more positive impact on engagement and achieving strategy. So I think there's a pretty logical connection there.
In terms of some of the benefits that I see from working from home, like one is just the productivity piece, like giving people more time and energy. Like if I'm from Toronto, so it's, you know, you can live in Midtown Toronto and it can still take you an hour or more to get downtown. So if people have the option of working a couple days from home, I think it gives them more energy and rest, and you know, that can be a benefit for sure. And then there's a big, you know, right now the COVID numbers are actually going up, and just cold and flu, and we're actually more mindful of cold and flu than I think we ever were before the pandemic. And you know, allowing people the flexibility if they might be well enough to work, but they shouldn't be going into work, because nobody wants somebody to go into work with a runny nose right now. And I think that that's also helpful and productive, because it means that team members, again, if they're not well, they shouldn't be working. But if they're well enough to work, you know, and they have a setup where they can work from home, there's some flexibility and fluidity there. And again, that's not a legal piece per se, although, you know, I have seen a lot of negotiations with paid sick days, and there's a lot of concern around people coming in sick to work, and can I send them home, and do I have to pay them? So some of that conversation around paid sick days, you know, is sort of relevant for remote work, and at the very least giving people the opportunity to work from home if they're well enough to work, but shouldn't be going into the workplace.
Great. Yeah, very, very interesting points there. And Linda, you touched on the word strategy. And so that's I think a key area as well. Like maybe what were some of the impacts potentially on organizations achieving their strategies during the pandemic, or when people have been working remotely? Is there an impact that has been seen, whether positively or negatively, on the actual organizational strategy?
Yes, what I observed and I'm really starting to see talked about more are two aspects in that. Leaders, the more senior leaders, became more visible during the pandemic because they could. It was actually easier for them to reach a lot of their employees that way. And a lot of those leaders themselves became more vulnerable too. They were going through, we often don't think about it, but those senior leaders were also going through their own challenges, trauma, and ability to fulfill their role. And those organizations who really got people productive and aiming towards strategy were the ones who really normalized the feelings and really spoke to them as people, how they were feeling, how they were coming in, and really gave them a sense of purpose. That is the number one factor. If people know what their purpose is and how they contribute and what they can expect, and who's noticing and talking about that. If they know their purpose, they're all in. We know exactly how we can contribute. And I think that was another one of the lessons learned, or maybe silver linings from the pandemic, is I think organizations really learned and developed, because they had to, but other ways to connect, and really that really is the kind of the secret sauce, if you will, sometimes, is people need to know a purpose and how they fit and how they contribute and that they're seen. And I think that really did help and make a difference compared to, you also asked about organizations, what maybe struggled to deliver on the business or the strategy. The ones who never did connect as humans, didn't have as much visibility and honesty from their leaders. And for people who were never given that sense of purpose or an opportunity to describe it, I think that would be some of the disconnect pieces. And I think we still have a lot of leaders and organizations that are still learning. And something Deborah had said earlier, now when employees are looking for their next employer, or should they stay or leave, one of the factors that will be a contributing one, especially if it is a desk type office position, is who wants to be in person by preference. What demographics really got ripped off during the pandemic and lost mentoring, coaching, connection. You know, we're smart. A lot of people have figured out, I don't want to be remote. I'll do remote one day, but if I can't be in person, I might not take that job. So I think people are also getting more comfortable knowing what they liked and didn't like and how to ask for it as well, in terms of how they really want to spend their work life, how they want to spend that time during the day. Because I really do think that the way people look at work and life has just blended, and it looks completely different now, even in their own mind.
I would definitely say, like, from the employee perspective, when I'm doing contract reviews and stuff, people today feel much more comfortable advocating for what they want. And that is not only work location, but salary and other things. And you know, in a way that I think is very different from pre-pandemic. And it's interesting, like, the correlation, but people definitely feel more comfortable advocating and asking for more and asking for things differently. Yeah, so I've seen that as a change.
Change for the better, I think. Would you say?
Change for the better, change for the
Yeah.
better. And also, like,
Yeah.
women advocating for themselves more, because often, in my practice over the last 15 years, I haven't seen it's become stronger. So yeah, definitely change for the better. And, when people know what they want more, they're going to be, more successful in their role, because employers want to hire someone and want to keep someone, so if somebody, knows what they want, they're going to be more likely to stay. Or if they can advocate and communicate with what they want, then, those changes can be made rather than them just jumping ship without communicating those needs. So those are all good changes for everybody involved, for sure.
Great. So I'm going to pivot slightly here. Are there any case studies that you have seen that maybe kind of highlight maybe organizations that have done really well, or ones that we can learn from with regards to remote work? And maybe, Deb, I'll come to you first of all.
Sure. And I believe we're going to distribute a paper that I wrote after this seminar about remote work and all the legalities. So some of this is in that paper, but you may recall, something that we saw is that there's been first of all, more strike action generally over the last, year or so, like major strike action. We haven't seen this type of strike action in Canada and the US, in a long time. So that's sort of interesting. And we saw with the CRA, one of the big issues in the strike that we experienced earlier this year was, the issue of work from home. And that was a big issue that the union was bringing on the table. Now, basically, it didn't end up in the collective of agreement. There, was understanding that, it would be considered on case by case basis, in particular circumstances, and it probably depends on, again, the role that the person's doing. I can say I had a call with the CRA a few weeks ago, and the representative I was speaking to was working from home. But we are seeing a lot of, on working from home and then work-life balance. My understanding is some of the issues coming up in some of the automotive industry in the States was more work-life balance in terms of numbers of hours worked and stuff like that. So I think all of it sort of comes together, and they are things that we're definitely seeing in the labor relations front for sure.
I am most interested in that going forward. Right now, I think we can look at things like engagement scores for sure. An individual organization can do that, or in a comparative type way. I think that's where we need to keep our eye on what research is going to say and describe. I think that is still in discovery, and I think it's the relationship side that is still to be determined. But one thing I have noticed is when you see a job posting on LinkedIn, for example, I'm seeing in almost every posting now, when we never saw it before, it either says remote, hybrid, or in person or on site. So that's actually said right at the beginning. So I think, to your point, Deborah, people can right away start to filter and decide if this is really going to be something for me. I really think that we're still learning, and I don't know that we'll come with a couple great conclusions, but I think we're going to see that the results will be more about the qualitative side in terms of how those conversations happen, how people are treated, what we're seeing in terms of how people do their job, in terms of what works and what doesn't. And not every role, and I think it's important to remember, not every role lends itself well to remote. And that could be different in every organization as well. It just never was a remote type role. But I know if many of you have, we can have conversation with our doctor online first before we decide if we have to go in and see them. So we're all in different ways benefiting from having it as an option to connect with someone, and how they're even delivering their job. But I'm most interested to read and follow what those bits of research are really going to provide for us.
That's great. And I do see that we have a lot of questions, a lot of traffic coming into the Q&A and chat. So I'm just going to go with one more of our questions right now, I think, before I hand over to Alex, just to make sure that we can really do justice to the many, many questions that are coming in. But the last thing that I'd like to touch on is workplace accommodations. How do they factor into remote work?
I love this question, and I'm glad you picked this question as the remaining one. It's the workplace accommodations piece is very important. So, for instance, if somebody has a physical injury and perhaps they need a couple months accommodation to work from home, and they get a doctor's note, like, an employer is most likely, it's going to be seen as a reasonable accommodation request if it's for a short period of time, some cases a long period of time. And again, it's going to depend on the role. But if it's an office job where they're sitting at a desk and they have hybrid and they have a medical note for a couple months accommodation, I think that, in most cases, it would be seen as reasonable. Even from a services perspective, I can tell you our office is mainly remote, but we had a client recently who has a hearing impairment requested an in-person meeting because they need to lip read, and they find on the video it's often delayed, and that's a reasonable accommodation request. So it's very important. I'd say working from home is a tool that we can use to accommodate certain circumstances, and I think that the onus is going to be harder on an employer now to refuse it just because it's so available, again, depending on the role. If your role is to be sitting at reception welcoming guests into a clinic and placing them in a room, then that's not probably going to be a remote role opportunity. But definitely people can make medical and otherwise accommodation requests, and I think that it's a good option for sure.
That's great. Okay, wonderful. So Alex, I am going to hand things over to you now so that we can start addressing some of the questions and comments that are coming in.
Absolutely. Thank you, Allison. And thank you guys for answering all those questions. That was wonderful. The first one I have here could be for either of you, so whoever wants to hop in, go right ahead. The question is the employer obligated to accommodate the work from home depends on personal circumstances or restrictions, etc., of the employee?
Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of vague, but for example, a thing that came up a lot for me during the pandemic and post-pandemic is family status. So say childcare responsibilities. And, you know, in that case, employees have an obligation to make reasonable efforts to secure childcare. So an employer doesn't legally have to allow work from home just because somebody says they have kids and they can't, you know, they need to look after their kids. The individual is going to have to try to make reasonable efforts to secure childcare. An example I could see that might be relevant is if somebody's been on maternity leave and daycare is really hard to get into. And let's say their daycare spot doesn't open up for 2 months after the end of their legal leave. I would see that as a reasonable accommodation request. Hey, I need a 2 month you know, work from home situation, or it might just be more time off because they're going to have to be productive at work. The employer, you know, is allowed to say, you know, I have to make sure that you're allowed to be productive at work. So they couldn't actually be, you know, taking care of the children while working. You know, medical accommodations might be easier to consider. And again, if it's a finite request for a few months versus a, you know, a infinite request, those are also going to be different. So a short-term request based on a physical medical issue versus a long-term request. Short-term, easy to argue, reasonable request is reasonable. Long-term, we might be asking different questions, but still might be reasonable in some circumstances.
The only thing I would add to that is that's a great thing, great question to consider holistically as well, because women are often disproportionately impacted by the demands and expectation of childcare or elder care. And so to help address the equality and the equity around this, I think that's a bigger society question, but I think an employer needs to be aware of that too, and what their objectives and responsibilities are to gender equity, diversity, inclusion as well. I think we need to look at that, the whole thing as well, because that and women have been negatively impacted in their career progression because of the remote work at pandemic. So I love that answer, and the fact that this is a good discussion to happen overall, to make sure that is this mainly something that's coming from your female employees. And I think that that is something organizations also keep their eye on as well.
That's a really good point.
Anything to that, Deborah, but that's like your thoughts or experience on that.
Well, I work with many women that have family status obligations, and you're right, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
I can say for myself it does right now, but you know, I think that that's where, you know, can the employer and you know, there's human rights accommodation requirements, but then there's flexibility beyond the legal requirements, which I think is also important for diversity and inclusion of women in the workplace. And for example, maybe that means, you know, a woman can't secure childcare after school, so maybe flexible hours. Can they do part of their? Can they change their hours? Can they work part-time, or can they do, you know, an hour of their work outside of the 9 to 5 to accommodate for some of those obligations? And those are conversations individuals can be having with their employers. And you know, maybe beyond the law, we need to look at what else can we do, just, you know, to meet some of these, you know, measures that we're, you know, there's a lot of lip service to trying to meet those measures, but actually to doing those things right now. So that's a great point, Linda.
Awesome.
Great answer, guys. Thank you very much. Just for all the attendees, a recording of this will be sent to you within 24 hours. Just getting a few questions about that. So just wanted to clear up any confusion around that. Another one here that's just a little bit vague, but I think is a good question. We are seeing significant medical notes requesting remote work for mental health. It says that they struggle with these and they wonder if you have any recommendations.
So that's a great question. It's going to, again, depend on the particular circumstances. So if the note is really vague, it doesn't have a time period, You know, an employer is allowed to ask for additional medical information. And typically we say you're allowed to ask for prognosis, not diagnosis. So you're not allowed to request the specific diagnosis of someone, but you can ask questions like, how long will those limitations last? You know, what are there other limitations? You're allowed to dig in a little bit. And, you know, I would say, you know, I've already said this, but a shorter request, let's say it's like a request for an accommodation for 2 weeks, that's more likely to be reasonable than a permanent request. And I think, you know, a permanent request, an employer is entitled to ask a lot more questions about prognosis and to dig in a little bit, because it might not be reasonable that they have a permanent accommodation to work from home. And in a generalized doctor note is certainly isn't sufficient to make that request.
Awesome. Thank you. Another one here. We have an employee who is working from home based on an accommodation that they have medical conditions that they should get COVID. It could be very serious to them. Realistically, how long could this type of accommodation last? Is there a point where the contract becomes frustrated?
So that's also a good question. So first of all, I mean, I would say the employer is entitled to get updated medical information from time to time. So, you know, is that still relevant now? Like, did you get that doctor's note in 2020 or 2021? I certainly think you can get an updated, you know, letter, because I think that you know, the impact of COVID is very different now than it was before. You know, people are vaccinated, there's, you know, different medical treatments. So I would get the updated medical request. And then, you know, at some point, the question of frustration for long-term disability, we sort of say generally, and this isn't, you know, an exact measure, but generally after 2 years, a contract can be frustrated if someone's off work with no reasonable expectation to return to work. You know, that's general. And again, case by case, don't take that as exact, but you know, the question is, would that type of thing apply for a work from home request? And, you know, I don't know that it would. It's going to depend on what the employee does. Is it a hybrid workplace, or is everybody else in the office full time, and what their medical prognosis is? There is a potential for a frustration argument, but I think it would be very complicated. And that's something I would say you have to seek legal advice on and guidance on what you can ask the employee and such.
Awesome. Thank you, Deborah. Another one here. How much does the economic impact of rebuilding space affect employers allowing more remote options?
Deborah, do you want me to speak a little bit about this one too?
Yeah, jump in. Yeah.
Okay, we'll tag team this one. Yeah, that's interesting. I've seen a lot of organizations really look seriously at their budgets and expenditures on keeping the office spaces that they have, especially if leases are coming due. They are in a major decision. I did see one large organization in this province actually expand their footprint and get more office space. So I don't think there's a perfect answer either way. And I'm not sure if the question is also about the employer's investment in making sure the employee has what they need in their home office and environment, that expenditure, or if it's more around office leasing. I mean, I know vacancy rates in many of our downtowns are still you know, high, and I'm also seeing, as I said, some expanding their footprint. So I'm not sure, you know, other than those are the things that I've observed, but not exactly sure what which one of those, if at all, was referred to in the question. But Deborah, what are you seeing for this question?
So I don't know that there's so many legalities around it, but you know, I like to read on different things, and I know like one like economist was saying like the hybrid model almost doesn't make sense if everyone's going to have an office in the workplace and at home financially. But what does make sense, and some organizations were doing this before the pandemic, is more of hoteling. So it's like, you know, you have office space, but it's not, you don't see those big corner offices for, you know, the partner of the law firm, versus maybe you have some office spaces that everyone can come and share and use when they're in the office, but people are not all in the office at the same time. You know, I've seen some organizations, what they do is they've actually made a smaller office, and then they have teams rotate. So team, certain team, the marketing team's coming in every Thursday, this team's coming in, and then they share the smaller space, which makes more sense financially. Most employers will provide a laptop and, mobile phone credit and, maybe internet credit for people working from home. It's something that employees should negotiate if it's not in their contract, or should look to. You, as an employer, you probably want the employee using a work computer that you have some sort of control over. You don't want them saving all your confidential documents on their home computer. At least if it's a work computer, you can have security measures and you can request it back and even remotely shut it down if you have that set up. So in terms of the equipment, I haven't seen tons of employment contracts provide, a few $1,000s for someone to put towards a workspace. However, I have seen that. So there's definitely financial implications of the decision, of where the work location is. And that's, again, going to be case by case, but maybe if an employer is forecasting increasing attendance at the office in the near future, it's a good time to get a lease,
All right, awesome. Thank you, guys. I got another good one here. They've all been good. If I have the ability to work from home, is it okay to use the work from home option when I am ill? We don't have sick days at my employment, and if we are sick, they take our vacation days.
Wow, there's a lot in that question, but I'll just, so I think that it depends if you're able to work. So an employer, if you're working from home, an employer is, can expect that you're going to be working. So if you're so ill that you're lying in bed all day not working, I don't know that that's, that you're not actually working. So, the issue around sick days and, an employer is not obligated to provide paid sick days unless there's something in your contract. Or, and that's, I'm speaking for Ontario. I don't know, the exact legalities across the country, but generally an employer is not required to pay for sick days unless your contract says you get 3 or 5 paid sick days, or there's a related policy that says that. But if you're working from home, you're expected to be working. So you shouldn't be sleeping or at the grocery store or golfing. You should be working.
Very well said. Another one here. In terms of occupational health and safety, what needs to be included in an OHS policy manual in regards to working from home? We are an industry exempt from workers' comp, and longer injuries are claimed through LTD.
So that's a good question. I mean, this is a hard one. I mean, I guess you generally want to say that an employee has to, take reasonable measures, but ultimately you can't control, what they're doing at home. And if they fall down the stairs and, is that actually considered a work-related injury or not? And that's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. Like, I remember when I was a junior lawyer, this was like, I don't know, 2008, 2009, or sometime a long, long time ago, far, far away. I was doing research on a WSIB question about, is a injury at home considered a work-related injury? And even at that time, it was complicated. The decision would go both ways, and sometimes the facts looked very similar. So there certainly could be liability when you have people working from home, and you can try to include that in your occupational health and safety policy. Employees have to take reasonable measures, and I guess if the employer really, really is concerned, they might even have, an ergonomic assessment and all that kind of stuff. But, that is very intensive. And depending on the size of the organization and what the person does, that might not be reasonable. So that was my lawyer non-answer, giving you a non-answer to a question.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there guidelines for leaders with respect to meeting their obligation to ensure the health and safety of remote/hybrid workers under their respective act?
I mean, I'm not aware of any guidelines. I might actually have Linda speak to the employee relations part of that question, like, if she has some thoughts, because that might be more interesting.
Yeah, so I won't speak to the act, of course, but I think this really does call on what the role of a leader is in an organization. What is the culture that they're responsible for evolving and creating within their team and with each other? If leadership teams have not had that conversation since post-pandemic recovery, they probably should. So what is the leadership philosophy? What are those leadership competencies that we are accountable to creating and developing and living here in our organization. And those are the performance objectives that leaders are expected to deliver and also be a part of as well. And so I think that's a great opportunity for people to talk about what is the culture we have, those leadership competencies that we are really focused on in this organization, and then what are those team guiding principles and how we work with each other, and what can we expect from each other as well. What does, for example, a culture of accountability look like? What does it mean to have an empathetic, supportive culture? How do we make sure our employees also have the development and the factors and parameters in place to also fulfill those obligations with each other? So I think that really does go back to the culture and leadership philosophy of an organization, and teams that have those conversations are getting at a lot of this stuff a little bit better, and their leaders are more confident when they're faced with such questions as well. And I think a lot of this goes to how confident are people in decision-making positions when they're asked these questions. So that would be how I would respond to that question, Alex.
And I should just add one more thought in terms of, like, there's a lot of questions about liability on injuries at home. Like, in my practice, I actually haven't even seen this come up. So that doesn't mean it's not coming up or it's not important or whatever, but I haven't seen this pattern. Like, I have both employer and employee clients, and I haven't seen this concern raised. And it doesn't mean it's not happening. I'm just, trying to say it can't be so common if no one in my firm is seeing this issue per se. And I'm not saying it's not important, but just something to note.
Absolutely. Okay. I think we got time for one more here. And there's one here that I'm actually curious about as well. Can you enforce someone to work at a desk or table? They have an employee who just got rid of their desk and is working sitting on a couch or in bed, which looks very unprofessional on external meetings on camera.
I love this question. This is a great question. I was saying earlier before we started, I took my dog out of my office to make sure that I seemed professional while I was presenting. I think that an employer can say that for team meetings, you are required to have a professional, setting. Now, granted, what does that look like? Like, I guess you could put in a policy, you have to be sitting at a desk. But if, ultimately, if people are working from home and they don't have the option of working from an office during a team meeting, what if their home is very small? Like then the employer has to think about, can I offer them a space if they don't have one at home? But you definitely could have a policy that has some requirements. But again, you have to be thinking about what other options are available to the person if they, depending on where they live.
Yes, and some organizations have the customer experience expectations. Would you show up like that on site with a customer, client, or teammate? Same thing when you're somehow working and how you personally present yourself. I do remember when we were early working remotely, there was one employee would get on a Zoom call with a customer wearing a toque. And the manager's like, would you do that if you were in person going to visit that client on site? Like, if you want to wear, you have so there's conversations about, and that's where people, I saw one of the questions in there about, are we glamorizing the remote piece? But I think the opposite too. I think we have to also have expectations that either mode of word is not taken advantage of either. Like you present yourself and your client facing expectation and cultural practices the same, whether it is remote or not. But I think those are and I think everything is always better if we have pets at work, maybe.
And I've seen that in contracts too. There's some contracts that have a policy where you're allowed to bring a pet to work.
Outside, but that's I think work and appearance and how you treat your client, your customer, your teammates, that should not change regardless of mode.
Completely agree. Well, thank you guys very much. Unfortunately, I believe we are at the time for questions. So I will pass it back to Allison for closing remarks. I just wanted to extend a thank you to the three of you guys for all being here today. It was a very informative and wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm just seeing the comment that came in towards the end there, people wearing a blazer and shorts that we observed early on in the pandemic. That was exactly what came to my mind. You know, people would be wearing pajama pants, but they would put their blazer on for when they were coming into meetings and things like that. So yes, thank you so much, Linda and Deborah, for all of your contributions and comments today. You know, the hope that we had from the IRC of kind of bringing the conversation together in this way is to, yes, cover the important legalities, but also it goes beyond that. You know, anytime we're looking at anything to do between the employer and the employee relationship, it goes beyond the law. It's really about the culture and the people that are being represented. So thank you to you both. Thank you to you, Alex, and Talent Canada. Just a reminder that the recording of the webinar will be shared afterwards. We will add into that a link to Deborah's article. So if you are interested in reading more on the topic, you will certainly be able to do that. And then a couple of things from the IRC. We are currently running our holiday promo where you can save 15% on all of our 2024 programs. So if you are interested in that, I recommend you take advantage of that before January 7th. And finally, we have another webinar coming up on December 13th at 11 o'clock, which is HR Transformation, how a skills-based approach will future-proof your organization. So that is with our facilitator, Wiley Burke, and that will be taking place on December 13th. But thank you so much for all of you for attending today. Apologies for the tech issues on my side. Again, the fun and the joys when we talk about remote connection or remote work. But I wish you all a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us today.